Goswami, Howard, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay, thank you for having me. Let's see. I began a serious spiritual practice, Bhakti Yoga, in 1969, which I've continued to this day. I after several years of that spiritual practice and doing a lot of things like opening dozens of centers in Latin America and also North America, I went back to school, went back to college, which I dropped out of in the 60s. And I finished up an undergraduate degree at UCLA in world religions, then went to Harvard and did a doctorate there in Sanskrit and Indian studies. And I'm very interested in topics like metaphysics and just sort of a general philosophical approach to understanding what's real. And I lecture a lot and I write books and try to keep myself out of jail. So that's basically it.
Cool. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that naturalism best explains everything that we see, all the arguments and evidence. Could you tell me some of the reasons you believe in Vaishnavism and what Vaishnavism is?
Sure. Vaishnavism, the word Vaishnava comes from the word Vishnu. And Vaishnavism is the main monotheistic tradition in South Asia. And it's based on the understanding that there are basically actually three fundamental types of things that exist, which are called tattvas, or just fundamental categories of existence, which are the category of selves or conscious souls, matter, physical world, and God. And it's the culture which produced yoga, many kinds of yoga. Perhaps the main text, certainly the beginning text, is Bhagavad Gita. And then the tradition historically was represented by many of the greatest scholars and intellectuals in South Asian history. There's a very distinguished tradition going back many, many, many centuries. And so I'm engaged now in sort of trying to create a bridge to see how that philosophy and theology and logic and so on, how it interacts with contemporary views. And I've taught at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, at the University of Florida, lectured in all kinds of universities, and published and all the usual things. So as far as why I took it up, of course, that gets to my epistemology, because by nature, I do require for myself good reasons to do what I'm doing. And so gathering all the evidence and looking at it from what I consider to be a reasonable perspective, I made my choice as far as what I think is real. And so here we are.
Cool. So what would you consider like the evidence? Or so Vaishnavism is a belief about specific belief about Hinduism, like the predominant one. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, Hinduism, the word Hindu is actually a mispronunciation of a Sanskrit word. There's a word Sindhu, which was the name of a great river that historically divided what we now call India from the Persian Empire. And so in Persian, in ancient Persian, which is actually a dialect of ancient Sanskrit, they pronounced an S at the beginning of a word as an H. So they called the land on the other side of the river the Hindu land, or Hindustan, stan meaning like place. And so then when there was a Muslim invasion, roughly 1,000 years ago, invasion of India, brutal, actually, brutal invasion. And they brought this pronunciation. So they called everybody that wasn't a Muslim a Hindu. And gradually, with the next wave of colonialism, which was the British, it somehow people in India didn't really use the word Hindu self-referentially until about 200 years ago or less. So what you find there was a whole collection of spiritual and religious traditions, but because they usually didn't kill each other over it, it didn't become clear to the West that they were actually different traditions.
It's a good summary. I like that. So remember we had a conversation briefly last time about naturalism and epistemology.
Yes.
What do you think is the correct epistemology? Because most people in the secular community, scientific community, think that religious beliefs are mostly unfounded. And do you think that they're unfair in that assessment, or that they shouldn't be as critical?
I think they are looking at it through one particular lens, and they're imagining that's the only lens.
Oh, you muted. We lost sound. Testing. Still on my end. Try refreshing the page, or you can try the settings for the audio. If you had a microphone, it might have gotten unplugged. Still nothing.
Okay, I found the problem. I just found the mic button and it was muted.
Gotcha. So yeah, we can hear you now. You're good.
Right. I was going to just read you just a sentence or two that I found this morning from Max Planck, who actually invented quantum theory. He's one of the greatest physicists of all time. And he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness, which you might take as a form of idealism, philosophical idealism. But ultimately, as you know, it gets down to epistemology, like what's your theory of knowledge? And so I find the idea that we can only know things empirically to be grossly irrational, and not to say philosophically claustrophobic. And interestingly, this was actually, the Wienkreis, the Vienna Circle, around 100 years ago, and they posited
logical positivism.
Yeah, logical positivism, and which was rejected by a strong majority of the atheistic philosophical community over 60 years ago. For one thing, because it's self-contradictory, because the statement that we should only accept as reliable facts things that are empirically verified, that statement can't be empirically verified because it involves immediately the most egregious form of circular reasoning. And so, I mean, to me, it's very clear that we have various ways of knowing. We have intuition, and all kinds of intuition. I mean, Plato talks about recollection. So the idea that the only means of knowing available to us is empirical, I think, is obviously not true. For example, take democracy. I mean, Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident being a technical philosophical term introduced by Aristotle. The idea being that it's self-evident that we are created equal, and that we have certain rights. And so if everything is just empirical, then we're not equal. Justice is imagination, and genocide is not morally wrong, because empirically we can't talk about right and wrong. So if we look at our deepest intuitions, about like some things are fair, unfair, some things are evil, like let's say raping people or murdering people and so on. Those are all metaphysical intuitions. And a world in which there's nothing, we can't know anything except what's empirically verified. First of all, to assert that is already to assert a metaphysical position. So a proposition which, if it's true, is not true, is not a good start for philosophy. So I think I'll just start with that.
Well, as you mentioned, most people rejected logical positivism, so it wasn't really the foundation for atheism or secularism today. I think the foundation is more that most religious claims don't have any evidential way to differentiate imagination from reality. And so there's no more support for religious claims than there is for leprechauns or fairies or unicorns or
Actually,
those kinds of
actually,
things.
actually, I think what you did just then, with all due respect, is that you kind of slipped back into logical positivism. So I think the real issue here is that, let's say, atheists, and everyone has a right to believe or not believe whatever they want, but I think the problem is, on the one hand, acknowledging, yeah, logical positivism is not really philosophically respectable now, but then kind of going through the back door right back into logical positivism. Because if it's not true that we need empirical proof to validate anything, I mean, nothing, or if we say we cannot claim to know anything unless it's empirically valid, which I think is absurd, then then if you say there's no proof, I would say there is proof. I would say that for most people on the planet, there's proof. It just may not be empirical. And I think the problem is that atheists, well, I'll be nice here. I think one thing we should avoid on both sides, I'm really trying to be nice, is that,
Don't worry about it. I'm totally fine with being not mean. It's totally gets more views that way. So
okay, so, and that is, no one appointed the atheists as the gatekeepers of objectivity. So, for example, they may say there's no proof. I mean, what we do find is that we don't have billions of people today believing in leprechaun. And so I have my experience, and I go back to Descartes. I mean, I think I have the most powerful epistemic foundation for what I accept to be true, because it's my first person, irrefutable, self-evident experience. And I mean, I can't prove empirically there's a real world outside my mind, but I'm going to go ahead and ride that horse, till the end of my life. That, yeah, there is a real world. I'm not going to be a solipsist. And so the idea that somehow atheists are the gatekeepers of objectivity and we have to get permission to affirm that something is true, or that we have to, first, I think empirical proof for God, I think, is on its face absurd, because the whole empirical method is based on the controlled experiment or controlled observation. You have to have, controlled access, even if you're looking through a telescope at a distant galaxy. And therefore, the idea of applying a method based on control to things that are beyond our control, it seems that it's entirely predictable that you will. It's like if I go out with a thermometer, let's say I go outside and I say, this is the only reliable scientific instrument, a thermometer, and I come back and I say, well, I've just proved that nothing exists except temperature. If you, so to rule out everything that might exist in the universe, which is beyond our control, including controlled access, observation, and so on, is to a priori commit yourself to a world in which everything that exists in principle is subject to our control, which to me is it's absurd to make that as an opening assumption in constructing your methodology or your epistemology.
I would agree. That's why I don't do that. I don't exclude the possibility of the supernatural, but you would still need some kind of a methodology to differentiate, is any particular claim correspond to reality or is it imaginary? And so
Okay.
science, I think, does a good job of that. So we can say scientific material things definitely exist because they have a method. But I don't see a reliable method that can differentiate imagination from reality in the context of religious claims.
Okay. I would say that that ultimately it's sort of historically adjudicated. It's in the sense that theologians and philosophers can argue until the cows come home and probably won't agree. Just as there are also disputes among scientists. If Thomas Kuhn's book, The Nature of the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he demonstrated, and it's pretty much a standard textbook now for a very long time, that what tends to happen is that one generation of scientists literally dies off, another generation comes in, and they have a different way to interpret phenomena. I mean, even for example, if you look in the last 30 years, there's a major intellectual revolution going on, even in the science community, and in terms of rethinking what consciousness might be. There are many scientists who, for example, I was just listening to a lecture this morning by what's that guy's name? Sorry. About he's a neurologist, actually, a neurologist at SUNY Stony Brook, and he was making the point there's all kinds of neurological evidence that consciousness cannot be reduced down to neurology, including that. Well, anyway, I can go through all the points, but so there are many neurologists. By the way, the idea that all neurologists are atheists or something. I happened to give a lecture in Sacramento about a little over a week ago. And one of the people attending the lecture was a professor at the University of California in Davis, which is a top university, and she's a neurologist. And so I said, well, someone told me that most neurologists are atheists, and her response was she just started laughing. And she, this is a person who has been in neurology her whole life, and she just thought it was no, that's not at all the case. They may not be Christians, or they may not be Jews, or this or that, but the idea that they are atheists, or strong atheists or materialists, is not true. So let's say I make a claim. I mean, to give like a typical thing they say in philosophy classes. Let's say someone claims that the great pumpkin rules the universe, and I say no, it's Krishna. And so you're saying, I mean, there's some merit to what you're saying. That okay, how do we distinguish these things? I think there are ways that we can go about it. Or let's say even worse than, I'd rather have someone believe in the great pumpkin than become a terrorist in the name of God. So how do we mediate? How do we distinguish? How do we even begin to look for objectivity in these different claims? Okay, here's one suggestion. One suggestion would be coherentism, which after foundationalism is probably the most important historically for epistemological theory. That if you have a worldview or if you have a certain philosophy, it has to be internally coherent. If it contradicts itself, it's not a serious contender. So we could look for coherentism. I would also want to rehabilitate, to some extent, the status of human testimony. Because what I've heard since I was a little kid is that the fact that most people that ever lived believe in some type of metaphysical reality beyond the empirical, that doesn't prove anything. But I want to say, really? It doesn't prove anything. So, because if I become radically skeptical about the value of human testimony, then other things may go out the window, like, let's say, belief in the scientific method, or belief there's a real physical world, and so on and so forth, because there's so many things we accept on human test. Or, for example, how do you empirically prove that that we should be able to go and rape and kill each other? Or we shouldn't be able to do that? How do you empirically prove we shouldn't be able to do that? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'd say that I'm a moral naturalist, so I think that we will be able to discover objective morality from natural facts in the world. So I think we will be able to test that in the future. But I think that the more important question is because we know testimony fails so often, it seems like a bad idea to put more trust in testimony because we know it doesn't work. We know it fails. We know there's.
But it does work. I mean, you're right that it. A lot of people say things that aren't true, especially politicians. It seems nowadays. But I would say that there's testimony and there's testimony, and that, for example, if you could give an example of something that learned people, not just sort of passionate people that don't read books, but if you give an example of something which huge numbers of human beings, including thoughtful people, have believed for thousands of years, but now we know it's completely false.
The flat Earth.
No, first of all, actually, that's sort of something the scientists try to convince us of, that everyone thought the Earth was flat, although the Greeks actually had a way of measuring the circumference of the Earth. But what I would say is, I would make a distinction here, a categorical distinction between just not having an advanced state of science. Like you could talk about Ptolemy's epicycles in astronomy, or, let's say mathematical proofs for a geocentric solar system. I mean, there are cases where people, you see, what I would say is, at a more fundamental level, that example doesn't prove your case, for this reason, that even when people didn't really think the Earth was flat, by the way, at least not that many people.
Well, I'm talking pre-Greek. So pre-Greek era, actually, many people did believe.
Okay, so let's take that. But then in that case, I would say it's simply an example where people had limited information, but they did believe, they shared our belief in the power of observation, which is the essence of science. They believed in the power of observation. They believed in common sense. They were not skeptical or cynical about what they could actually see in front of them. As far as whether, I mean, maybe you could cite a text, like an ancient, let's say, pre-Greek text, or where people actually stated the Earth is flat, and if you walk off, I mean, I don't.
Sail off. So most of them involve sailing off of the edge of the Earth. So yes, there were many different cultures who thought that. From watching the ships that sail off into the distance and you lose sight of them, they thought they fell off the edge.
See, I think that's a myth for this reason, because ancient people all had experience of ships falling off the horizon and then coming back with commercial goods. Because, for example, we know, let me just give one example, because it's my field, Indology, that we know there was a very vigorous commercial trade between Western India and the Persian Gulf. And if you look at the geography, you kind of sail right around and of course, they didn't have a Suez Canal then, but you get very close to where the canal is now, and you could just easily cross over to the Mediterranean. So there was actually a lot more international connection in ancient times than people tend to think. And so I would say that, and there's many examples, for example, in ancient Sanskrit literature, analogies or metaphors involving crossing the sea. So everyone had experience of ships crossing the sea and coming back with trading goods or other things. And so to say that everyone thought that, but even if some people thought the Earth was flat, which I am not convinced of. I mean, I'm sure some people thought that, but it wasn't like a generally accepted notion. But even, let's say, if it was, it's simply because they didn't have enough empiric information. But they believed in the empirical method. They believed that, seeing is believing. They just, if you look at science, if you look at scientific theories from the 1600s, 17, 18, 19, or, for example, we don't know what dark matter is. I just got I get all these endless newsletters and articles from Harvard as an alumni, and I was just reading one the other day. It was about dark matter from their, some of their lead astronomers. They said, we don't know what it is. And so they conjecture. So the history of science, in fact, what they brag about is really the merit of science. The glory of science is that they're not afraid to theorize, and then you get new information and you refine your theories. So even if some people thought the Earth was flat, which means they lived in a place where they never saw a boat sail somewhere and then come back, which doesn't sound right. But anyway, let's say that was the case. Even then, it doesn't mean they were not open to the scientific method. They were just, that was their best theory based on the empirical evidence available to them. So I don't think it really makes the case. What I'm talking about is
Well,
people.
just if you mind, so many ancient cultures subscribed to the flat Earth cosmology, including Greece until the classical period, the 5th century BC, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age civilizations in the Near East until the Hellenistic period of 31 BC, and China until the 17th century. So there's quite a few of them that had that, and this
I,
was
I would like to see. I would like to see evidence from their literature, because
okay.
because yeah, I would. Because as I know, for example, the Greeks were very much a seafaring people, as were the ancient Phoenicians, and they were watching boats go over the horizon every day and coming back. If you look at the whole, because as we know, Northern Europe was not so advanced. You got more developed civilization around the Mediterranean for various reasons. And they were seeing ships go off the horizon every day and come back. But in any case, still, even if they thought the earth was flat, my point is they still bought into the empirical method. If they did think that, it was based on the best empirical evidence that was available to them at the time. And if you look at the history of science, it's constant revision of theories, constantly getting new information.
Right. So I would agree with that part, but your question was like, is there a belief that a lot of people share that science proved was wrong? And yes, the vast majority of our beliefs are beliefs that most people had that were proven wrong by science, like
Well, science,
stars.
yes, science by definition, science has never proved that spiritual belief is wrong. And in fact, the very idea of them proving that is absurd. Like they,
Right. So
yeah,
that would be like an unknown, one of the things we haven't shown yet.
it's unknown to science. I mean, I'm sure you will agree that in our discussion, we can't give an argument that in the future, I could say that in the future, most scientists will have powerful spiritual experiences and agree with me. So,
Right. So my argument, just to clarify, my argument here is that testimony isn't trustworthy because lots of people used to believe lots of things based on their testimony, which was proven wrong by science. And so science is a better form of evidence than testimony, and testimony is unreliable. So we should not trust testimony as a reliable basis to come to accurate beliefs.
okay, I have a few points against that. First of all, since the history of science is a history of constantly revising and correcting false views, according to what you just said, we shouldn't believe science either today, because obviously they don't have complete understanding. Especially, I think to be a materialist has become somewhat an ironic position, since more and more we don't know what matter is. And also the old view, which is now increasingly crumbling, that we live in a complete deterministic physical world, is also crumbling, because of all, at the quantum level, there's so many things that are not deterministic, at least to the best of our knowledge now. But anyway, the main point I wanted to make is that epistemically, there's a clear distinction, in my view, between, let's say, accepting the validity of a particular methodology, say empiricism, which obviously flat earthers at that time, I think if someone's a flat earther today, I think they're hopeless. But if someone was a flat earther, let's say thousands of years ago, it was just the best interpretation at the time of the empirical data. At the same time, I think let's say someone believed, or thousands of years ago, or some people have believed all through history, that they're having a direct experience of something which is metaphysical, of something which is beyond the physical. And so in that case, we don't have because it's not empirical, it's not physical, it's metaphysical. In fact, we don't have a historical record of realizing that was all wrong.
Wait, that part I think I'm going to disagree with. So we have many cases where people have personal testimony of spirits, dead loved ones is a good example, bereavement delusion, something that 60% of people experience. And throughout most of time, people thought they were actually seeing dead loved ones, but really it's just a problem that the brain has by making strong connections between certain emotional experiences and patterns. And because of this, people will see, hear, touch dead loved ones. But we know for a fact that's a bereavement delusion. We know it's fake. We know it's a thing in the brain.
Actually, we don't know for the following reason. And this gets into a key philosophical point, I believe. And that is, we all accept there's a brain. We all know that. We all know that. So we're not going to argue about neurology. current neurology. We also know that certain parts of the brain are associated with certain kinds of mental activities. So that, for example, if someone feels pain or if someone, there's, different kinds of basic conscious experiences that we can link to certain specific parts of the brain. Like when someone is, let's say, afraid or feels pain, then certain parts of the brain light up or certain parts of the brain are active. What's interesting is that as you get into higher functions, such as philosophy or math, advanced math, and so on, we don't link these higher order mental activities with specific parts of the brain. And I can send you the link for that by a neurologist at SUNY Stony Brook. And so let's say two different possibilities. Say one possibility is that somehow our brain or nervous system in general produces consciousness as some kind of epiphenomenon. And another possibility is that consciousness is not ultimately physical, although it interacts with matter. It's not ultimately physical, and in fact, our whole nervous system is conducting consciousness. And as we know, let's say if a wire is conducting electricity, and if you cut the wire, you don't get the electricity, or if you mangle the wire or crush the wire. And so if a particular object is being conducted by another object, then in that sense, what you do to the conductor affects the transmission. So if it's a fact, so in both cases, what I don't understand, what I'm not aware of is if the brain conducts consciousness or if the brain creates consciousness, how that would be obvious in neurological studies. It seems to me that in both cases, from the neurological point of view, as many neurologists actually say, I can't say majority of them, but there are very respectable neurologists who have, done a lot of research and published a lot of papers and teach at prestigious universities, who feel that there's nothing in neurology which requires us to believe that the brain creates consciousness as opposed to conducting it.
Well, I'm not sure that's relevant to my point. So in neurology, I know for sure the consensus is that hallucinations, bereavement delusions, false memories.
Okay.
But those are independent of physicalism. So we know that these happen. We know there's this.
I'm sorry. I'll address your point directly. So so first I'll just lay out two simple options. One option is, as you said, it's bereavement delusion.
Yep.
And the other option is that people are communicating with departed ancestors or relatives or whatever.
Sure.
So I'm actually curious. This is a sincere question. What is there about the neurology that proves one and rules out the other?
The correlation to all the other kinds of hallucinations that we have. So, for example, there are many hallucinations where people say they saw a horse or something physical. So they thought they saw a physical thing that literally wasn't there.
Okay.
And we can show this in certain kinds of hallucinations. Like if I show you a picture of a Rubik's Cube, have you seen this? There's a very famous optical illusion with a picture of a Rubik's Cube and there's two orange dots in the middle. And to our eyes, they look like they're very different colors. But when you delete the rest of the screen, they're the exact same color. And so in this case, this isn't like talking to a dead loved one. This is just your brain made a mistake. And we can show your brain made a mistake.
Okay. So let's go with that.
Well, I'm going to leading to somewhere here. And we know from these mistakes, if we build them together, it leads to more complicated mistakes. Like there's a specific kind of delusion people have where they will imagine being assaulted by someone. And there's a very specific case where a woman fell asleep in front of a TV and was watching an actor on a TV screen, and she accused him of raping her, but obviously had a very good alibi. He was on TV at the time on a live radio station. And so this case we know was false. This did not happen. This is just a hallucination. And so all of these cases are exactly analogous to the cases of people seeing dead loved ones. But for some reason, you want to treat that one as special and say maybe they actually saw the dead loved one. but that's exactly the same as saying, well, maybe he did actually teleport and was in two places at once and actually did assault her. Like, no, that's ridiculous. And so it seems to me that we can make, because of the large body of evidence of how delusions work and what phenomenon they explain, that we can see people seeing dead loved ones is exactly analogous to all these other things that it explains. And to think it's some special category where we should consider that maybe they actually saw a dead loved one would require some more evidence of other things that exist.
Okay,
Whereas
okay,
saying it's caused by these other hallucinations, we already have tons of evidence for, so it makes a lot of sense.
okay, okay. Interesting point. So let's for now just say go with the idea of bereavement delusion. Let's just go with that for now. However, it seems to me the weak link in your argument is to say that all metaphysical experiences are exactly analogous to bereavement delusion. For example, what about the delusion that somehow or other we all have equal rights, which is empirical meaninglessness? It doesn't, I mean, empirically, it doesn't mean anything because there's no such thing as a right empirically. There's no such empirical object. And so my point is that there are many metaphysical things, like, for example, the fact that it's wrong to rape and murder people, or, genocide is bad. There are all kinds of metaphysical assumptions we make, or, for example, the assumption that there's a real world outside our mind, which we can't empirically prove because that would be circular reasoning. So there's all kinds of and I'm not saying metaphysical assumptions are wrong, but there's all kinds of metaphysical assumptions we make which are not analogous to bereavement delusion. And so my argument obviously would have to be that, and by the way, I do not at all rule out that some people have very delusional quote unquote experiences about God. I think terrorists are extremely delusional when they think that, God wants them to go and, and blow up a school bus or something. I think that's total evil delusion. So I accept that there are delusional states of consciousness. I accept that people may have delusional religious visions or beliefs. However, just like there's pseudoscience. So if we allow there's like real science and pseudoscience, we can't rule out a priori. We can talk about it. We can't rule out the fact that there could be delusional religion. And just to give one simple behavioral test, I think, because as you, I'm sure you know, there's all kinds of evidence that sincere, whether it's delusional or not, sincere religious belief in many ways improves people's lives. And there's like unlimited research on that. So I would say that obviously I would have to begin from a certain assumption, the assumption being that God is good. And of course, that leads to all kinds of other discussions. But let's say if I base it on my claim that God is good, and therefore if someone by their so-called religious practice or belief or whatever is becoming, in a way that I think you and I could agree, a better person in terms of how they treat other people and so on and so forth, then I would say whatever their belief is, I may not totally believe it, or I may think there's a little bit of delusion in, but it's not, I think in some fundamental way they're onto something. Whereas when people claim to be religious and are doing evil in the world, and we know there's been a lot of that historically, and there's been a lot of evil done by atheists also, if we want to be fair, then I think that would count against that. So we can't lump it all into one big category. Every belief that looks like religion in some way is exactly analogous to bereavement delusion. I think that's a huge assumption, which is going to break down in many ways.
Well, sure. So I would agree that there's different kinds of beliefs, and different claims require different levels of burdens of proof, different kinds of evidence. And so, like, if you take morality, for example, I don't think there's any like super strong evidence of objective morality. I believe there is an objective morality, but the evidence we have is looking at patterns in moral intuition and moral progress and philosophical dilemmas and saying, oh, look, there's a pattern here. And we can infer this pattern by looking at changes in cultures through time and through technological gain and cultural shifts and say, there's a very clear pattern going in a single direction. And so in that case, we provided evidence. It's not simply the fact that lots of people believe this, that doesn't matter. And it's not the fact that it could definitely be a delusion. It could just be a product of evolution, and that's fine too. That's probably the strongest evidence of what explains morality. But at least we can provide some other basis of evidence here, which is that there's a very clear pattern of moral progress.
Okay, but you see, the word progress is circular.
Well, progress, the word there doesn't matter. There's a pattern, and whatever we label it doesn't matter. So because there is a consistent pattern in a single direction, whatever you want to call the direction doesn't make a difference, because that's still one direction, not the other. So there's a pattern.
But I think it does make a difference for this reason. I mean, Kant talks about people's deep moral intuitions, which I'm not going to get into Kant because I disagree with him about a lot of things. But for most people, based on their deepest intuitions, and I don't rule out intuition as, under proper conditions, a legitimate form of knowing. For most people, let's say I'm morally outraged because I hear that someone raped someone or murdered someone or whatever, my outrage, I don't think that why didn't the perpetrator get the evolutionary biology memo? That, in other words, it's not really wrong to rape and murder and genocide. Those things aren't really wrong. But it's almost like Plato says, sometimes you have to tell people a myth in order to get them in good moral order. However, I want to live in a world in which people don't murder and rape and steal, and therefore I'm going to propagate this myth. I'm not only going to say that, and also it's not at all clear to me that blind evolution would bestow reproductive advantage on people who are moral. I think you could make a historical argument. I mean, at least it would be a debate. I'm not saying how it would come out, but it would be a serious debate. You could say that people who just take what they want and they kill all the weaker specimens. It's evolution, survival of the fittest. And if you look at the animal species, they're brutal and violent, and the alpha male kills the other males unless they back off. And we don't see species going extinct because of that. So it's not at all clear to me how a moral system where the alpha male doesn't just kill anyone that challenges his authority, and the alpha male reproduces with all the females, and the other males, it's their tough love. It's not clear to me that kind of brutality and is definitely crippled other species in terms of their ability to reproduce and survive. So the argument that blind evolution would choose what we might agree on as a good moral system, where people respect each other's rights and people, nice people. It's not at all clear to me that would bestow a moral advantage. In fact, I could say in history, there are many cases in history where, let's say, countries lost to other countries or kingdoms or whatever because they had moral considerations that the enemy didn't have. And so I don't think you can mobilize evolution here as an explanation of morality. And even if you could, which I think on historical grounds wouldn't work, but even if you did do that, I think it's not what everybody means. And so then what you have to say is that basically almost everybody in the world is completely deluded, because almost everybody in the world thinks that some things are really right and some things are really wrong, but they're all an illusion. And it's really just blind, evolution-based neurology, which I think is a terrible explanation, since a lot of our moral instincts are some of our most powerful intuitions, things that we know are true as much as we know anything is true.
So a few things there. One is that evolution does explain that. They've done a number of tests where they've shown that social species that cooperate to a higher degree survive to a higher degree, and more selfish species don't survive to the same degree. And so evolution would select for more altruistic kinds of behaviors. They've demonstrated that.
Can I respond to that one?
Well, my point, I'm a moral realist, so I don't think it's evolution. So I would agree with you in that context. So that part is pretty unambiguous in biology. They've explained that fully. But I think that there is an objective morality, and it's not based on evolution. But the difference I'm trying to illustrate here is that for evolution, we have like evidence, moral progress. We have patterns that we can look at that show us, give us reason to believe this thing exists. That isn't just the intuition. We're not
Uh,
just looking at people's intuition.
okay, a couple of points here. Number one, um, I always observe what I consider to be pretty comical attempts by some of these materialistic scientists to sort of say that, yeah, you can be an atheist and you can be a physicalist and all that. You're not going to lose anything you really care about, like morality. And I think their theories are absurd, because if you say that, let's say that is true, as you said, that in order for I don't know, group of animals of whatever species to flourish in terms of surviving and all that, there has to be a certain degree of cooperation, and if that degree of cooperation is lacking, then they won't do as well. However, the degree of cooperation needed for survival and even flourishing is still way below the morality bar of what we would consider to be a civilized society. Because, for example, lions, the male lion, sometimes kills its own children. And yet lions aren't going extinct because of that. So at the same time, lions do cooperate. So the fact that there's a minimum level of cooperation needed to survive or flourish doesn't mean that minimum level is anything we could recognize as a moral society. That's one point. Another point is that I think I forgot it. So you're lucky I forgot my other point.
Well, the first thing is that social species usually succeed more if they have a higher level of influence over the environment. So if we're in technological societies, having more cooperation has a higher level of success rate than selfish ones. So if we replaced humans with lions, human society would collapse because they don't have the correct level of cooperation to sustain that amount of integration. And so the level of cooperation required to build a successful society increases with the amount of influence the society is interacting with the environment, or something along those lines.
Oh, okay, but okay. So let's say, I mean, I'm not sure about that, but let's just go with it for the moment. I would still say that you could have. I think the real question to ask would be, what is the minimum level of cooperation needed, and would it look like a moral society? For example, Hollywood puts out so many dystopian movies. I mean, movies about a dystopian future. And often they're very technological, they're very technologically advanced. And so, in fact, there's a great debate going on right now between two parts of the world. I mean, clearly on the side of Russia, China, and Iran, they're saying that tyranny is more efficient. And and the West has another view. So what I'm saying is, I think you'll never be able to prove that everything that we consider to be essential morality is necessary in order for a group of people, even let's say advanced mammals who have machines and everything, to survive, and perhaps even to flourish. It's I don't think, I mean, I'm absolutely sure that no one could show that. You don't have to be like everyone's nice, respect each other's rights. What if, for example, you have a particular society where, let's say, the people who are most intelligent, most powerful, enslaved the lower classes? I mean, the Roman Empire lasted for many, many, many centuries, and they had certain practices which we would find to be horrible, like, for example, paterfamilias. The fact that I mean, you talk about patriarchy, it kind of makes me laugh when people talk about patriarchy. You want to see patriarchy where the father of the family has power of life and death over the other members of the family and his slaves. And yet Rome went on for quite a long time. It eventually collapsed, as we know. It didn't go on. But then again, what society continued to be moral, forever? Because
right. So I agree with you that you don't need morality to have a thriving society. That's not not the part of the argument. But I wanted to go back to my main point here, which was that even in the case of morality, which I agree with you is a real thing, you need something more than intuition to justify belief that it's real. And in the case of religion, I don't see that more than intuition. I see the intuition, which is the same as morality, and it's the same for leprechauns and bereavement delusions. They all have the intuition factor, but the intuition factor isn't reliable. It's not enough because we know it makes mistakes a lot, most of the
Uh,
time.
I think it's very significant. There's never been a sustainable metaphysical system, religion, based on belief in leprechauns. So I know you bring that up a lot, but I think the fact is that even take Christianity. Even take Christianity with what I feel that I don't mean to disrespect, but I think there are several points in their basic theology which I find extremely irrational. And so,
I would agree.
yeah. So what we find is that Christianity, they definitely grew in the Roman Empire, even pre-Constantine, but that there's never, I'm not aware of a case where they just became dominant simply by everyone making free choices without coercion. In fact, what we find in the West since the Renaissance and the revival of pagan culture and all that, that Christianity has been steadily losing ground, which I think so. Leprechauns, I'm not sure that I don't see any historical evidence. I don't see any historical evidence, and having studied history a lot, that someone could just believe in some quirky thing like leprechauns, and you can get large numbers of people over a long period of time to base their lives on that. So when I look at, in fact, I would say that one of the a typical specious argument is, oh, there's so many religions, they all claim they're the only way, and they all contradict each other, which is completely false on two grounds. Number one, they don't all contradict each other on major points. Number two, they don't all think they're the only way. And so you kind of take the worst, it's a straw man argument because you take the worst kind of religion, which is fanatical, theologically challenged religion. If you look at the Interpretatio Greco or the Interpretatio Romano, which was basically they were strongly held beliefs for most of the people in Greco-Roman civilization that there's one divine power, whatever you call it, however you conceive it theologically, and that people in different cultures call it by different names. You could, and so in fact, Tacitus, one of the great Roman historians who was just after Jesus and still considered to be a great historian, even by modern standards, and he's very much afraid of what will happen if fanatical Middle Eastern religions take root in the Roman Empire. He says that, they're going to ruin everything.
I'm not
And
sure. So my argument here was that any beliefs
yeah,
of any kind, which are all going to be based on some kind of intuition that you had some experience,
right.
isn't enough. So having the intuition isn't enough. You need something more. So in the case of morality, we have something more. We have evidence of moral progress. I don't see the more in the case of religion, and it seems like you're arguing that.
That's
What?
circular.
What? What?
But,
Well,
that's
I don't. What, I said I don't think I don't see the more in the case of religion, and it seems like you're saying that the more is the fact that it built a successful society of some kind, and I don't
no,
think that's evidence that it's true.
not just that. Okay, let me try to clarify because I can understand how maybe it's not so clear. Basically, I was arguing against the idea that anyone can make up or even believe any absurd thing and it will have the same traction and historical mileage as what we actually find to be pretty much universal ideas, basic universal ideas about the nature of a metaphysical reality, and not imposed violently, as in the case of Christianity or Islam in many cases. Actually, I had this debate. I was speaking to some gentlemen representing Islam, and they were giving as an argument in favor of Islam being the religion that there's amazing uniformity of thought, which I said, well, that has nothing to do with the violence, right? But anyway, so my point is rather this. I would make an argument, and I'll try to be more clear about this. I think what I'm doing is I'm making an argument that, in fact, human beings, very large numbers of them, do have certain very deep and almost something approaching universal perceptions or intuitions about the nature of a metaphysical reality. And to give one simple example of that, well, anyway,
Well, I
so
would agree. Therefore, what?
therefore, what I would say is that if you have wide agreement by humanity, not obviously nothing like unanimous agreement, but wide agreement on certain basic metaphysical principles, and if in the past, not always, because science has been used for good and evil, as we know, Hitler had a scientist, but often that these near universal or quasi universal beliefs tended to be the foundation of moral systems that, at least to some extent, we could recognize as having some validity, then you can't just say that's meaningless. Because to say, well, that means nothing, that's like leprechauns. No, because in fact, we don't find beliefs that we would consider eccentric or just bizarre beliefs like leprechauns or whatever did not have the same traction, have not attracted large numbers of people, have not, especially I would say, because there's all kinds of science doubters at a level of people who are not so educated, it's all just a conspiracy. So I think we have a right to talk whether we're evaluating, the track record of science or religion.
Well, one second. There's two things there. One is that when I look at most religious beliefs, they seem equally as ridiculous as leprechauns. I mean, there's a cosmic zombie Jew who rose from the dead and sacrificed himself to himself because he forgot to put a fence around a tree, and a talking snake convinced a rib woman to eat the magical apple from the tree. That's pretty ridiculous. I don't see how that is any less ridiculous than leprechauns. But even if we granted that, let's say we grant that.
Okay, I want to respond to what you just said. Because what we find is, even in Judea, let's say Adam and Eve, that story, which I personally don't believe is literal history. So what I found growing up in a Jewish environment is that the Adam and Eve story played almost no role in the lives of people. That's not, they knew the story and they didn't, publicly rebuke the story, but that's not what anyone really cared about. And so in every religion, and frankly, you can find all kinds of bizarre, eccentric theories in science, which at one time were the scientific mainstream. And I would not at all rule out that some current beliefs, not proven facts, but current beliefs, best guesses about dark matter, turn out to be just as laughable. So the point is, if we look at not what someone said who wrote a holy book, but what actually was the foundational convictions and intuitions of people who had some level of education, and in terms of their faith, in terms of their belief, it wasn't about Adam and Eve, and at least not the way I grew up. And it wasn't about, so we have to compare apples and apples here. There have been many very eccentric scientific theories which were disproven.
Well, I agree with you. My point is that people believe lots of completely ridiculous things all the time. Like take Scientology, right, where the Xenu nuked the volcanoes to free the souls of the Wobblegoos. Or take Mormonism, where Jesus went to Idaho after he died and rose from the dead. There are lots of completely ridiculous beliefs. And so I think it's false to say that religions are not equivalent to leprechauns. I mean, leprechauns just don't have any implications about ontology.
The reason I say that, the reason I still say that, is because I think you're mixing two things. And that is, on the one hand, there are basic intuitions. I think very few people besides Joseph Smith had a basic intuition that Jesus went to Idaho. What I think happens, based on my own experience with religious movements and religious life, is that you have basic truths about, basic theological or metaphysical truths. And when people discover those within a particular tradition, whatever the tradition is, because the experience can be so powerful, it's kind of like it's a package deal. Like, okay, you had this powerful experience with God with us, so It's like I compared, if you go to the store and you just say you want to buy one apple, but that store is only selling bags of 5 apples. If you want one apple, you buy 5 apples. And so those things about Jesus in Idaho, I would say, maybe some people, but so I'm talking about the fundamental core, and then there's a superstructure where, okay, once you are convinced you had an experience of God or a soul, now here's all the theology that goes with it. Whereas
Well, I think the fundamental core consists of tens of thousands of fallacies and biases and delusions and illusions. So one of the most common ones is that after you watch a scary movie, you feel like you're afraid of the dark because you think there might be a monster there. This is a fundamental intuition that pretty much all human beings have when they're afraid. They're afraid of the dark. And this is not a rational thing.
it is,
When
it's
you
totally rational. It's totally rational.
well, no, there's no monsters in the dark. Like
No,
there
no,
can be.
no. What I'm saying is, okay, when I was a little kid, I believed in the tooth fairy. I became, tooth fairy agnostic pretty early in life. But the fact is that most people do not believe there are monsters in the dark. However, just in terms of just a purely empirical, physicalist point of view, the dark is dangerous because if you can't see, you don't know what's there. And I know, for example, let's say I'm in my house and the doors are locked and the lights suddenly go out at night, and I'm trying to find a candle or something. So I'm not so afraid. Let's say I'm walking on a highway or driving my car and I suddenly can't see for whatever reason. Let's say all the street lights go out and I'm driving at high speed. It is dangerous. The dark is dangerous. And therefore, I think very few people actually believe in there's monsters in the dark, but they do believe rationally that to suddenly be in a situation where you need vision just to be safe and suddenly you can't see, that is dangerous. It's a rational fear.
Well, the reason I bring this up is because prior to scientific progress, many cultures actually thought there were demons that literally lurked in the darkness. And if the lights went out, the demons could get you. And this is a very common religious belief throughout history. And it was
However,
an intuition that was
okay,
wrong.
but what you also find is that in these ancient civilizations, that those beliefs tended to be embraced by people who were not the best and the brightest. For example, Plato's Republic. In Plato's Republic, he's really down on Homer because Plato argues that there are philosophical reasons, good philosophical reasons for theistic beliefs. Even Aristotle, who was definitely not religious, he gave his argument from contingency, the unmoved mover. However, Plato says that Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is kind of like the core of the Paideia, the Greek educational curriculum, which was very popular around the Roman world, is nonsense. And actually Plato makes this very, very radical statement that we should stop teaching Homer to children because it's giving them a very irrational view of metaphysical things. So you can, again, it seems to me it's just like a series of straw man arguments. Take the stupidest people, take the most superstitious people, and they represent a civilization. I mean, look at American voters, for God's sake. So
when I mention these are things that happen in all human brains. This is a fallacy that is in all human brains. That's why it's a named fallacy.
No. I don't believe that all human brains thought that there are scary creatures in the dark. I think that more rational people understood on very good grounds that the dark is dangerous.
This is called a type 1 and type 2 error. It's one of the classical examples in neurology of things that the brain does because of evolution that are just false illusions that happen to just pretty much every human being. That's just innate in human brains. So we know that there's tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, illusions, delusions, hallucinations that are named. And they're named because we know that they are things that happen in pretty much every human brain.
No. Every human brain doesn't think there are little monsters in the dark. But I think every human brain rationally thinks, and this is what evolution would tell us, not there's monsters. That I think is a cultural superstructure. I think what every human brain rationally believes that in certain situations, if the lights go out or if I'm suddenly in the dark, it's dangerous. I mean, I personally would not at all want to walk through a forest at night in the dark without a flashlight or even with a flashlight, because there are all kinds of predatory creatures. And for example, where I live, they have, all around, I live in this actually beautiful area in the hills of Southern California by campus. And there are all these signs saying, watch out for rattlesnakes. And so I absolutely would not want to step on a rattlesnake in the dark or run into a mountain lion. So I don't think we're wired to think there are these evil creatures in the dark. And the proof that we're not wired for that is that most people don't believe it, and most people haven't believed it. And we have proof from thousands of years ago in Plato and other writers. So look at America today.
Well, the proof here is that we have an intuition to be afraid of the dark, and then people take their cultural beliefs and try to explain why that's the case.
Some people
all people do this. This
No.
is why every religion exists. This is why every cultural belief is why leprechauns exist.
What you're saying is empirically not the case. Because, for example, I never believed that. I never believed there were monsters in the dark. No one in my family ever believed that. And no one I ever knew ever.
No. You have an intuition to be afraid of the dark. Everybody has that.
And that's
an intuition to explain the unknown.
But I'm very glad I have that, because
that doesn't matter. This is what I'm proving. So this part is correct. Everybody has a fear of the intuition, and everybody has an intuition to try to explain things they don't know. They make up stories to explain the unknown.
No, everyone doesn't do that, because I always was a little nervous if I was alone, out in the world in the dark. And I never, ever, and no one I've ever known in my life ever made up a story about it.
Yes, they do. That's literally, the brain does this. So if you try to see someone in the dark and you think it's a family member, your brain is doing that. So this is something that literally have been proven. Every brain that is alive does this. It's just a
however, if you are but that's not, thinking or hoping. I'd have to see the studies, because I've never, ever experienced, I don't know anyone that's ever experienced the things you're calling universal.
Type 1 and type 2 errors, they are literally universal. This has been proven scientifically. We have dozens of studies. Google type 1 and type 2 errors.
Then why didn't I ever experience it?
You did. You've experienced type 1 and type 2 errors. They're called false positives and false negatives.
Irrational child. I'll give you an example. One time I was attending a spiritual festival in West Virginia, and there was no indoor plumbing, and I needed to, so I had to go out, and this was on a hilltop in West Virginia. It was like pitch dark. I don't even know how I made it. And I didn't want to relieve myself right next to the house I was staying with other people. So I walked a little bit, maybe 20 yards, and to relieve myself. And then I heard someone else moving in that area. And my first instinct was not that it's a family member, but that, and one of the reasons, of course, I was a little concerned is because I had a shotgun pulled on me by a redneck hillbilly the day before. But in any case, it's just not, you can't just declare things to be universal when so many people have never experienced anything like that.
Yes,
I would say that being afraid of the dark in certain conditions, not in others, in fact, is something given to us by nature to protect us. And
being afraid of the dark is a single example of which there are millions examples of things.
However, I never met anyone in my life. I never met anyone in my life that made up a story about some kind of monsters in the dark. I've never, this is when you just told me this.
You're religious. You literally have.
No, I haven't. No, but you're begging the question so egregiously.
Because this doesn't matter to the argument. Being afraid of things in the dark. Being afraid of things in the dark is one example. It doesn't matter if anyone in your life has experienced
being afraid in the dark is rational.
It doesn't matter. That's not the point I'm making. That is irrelevant to the point I'm making. The fact that a large percent of people are afraid of the dark and make up stories is an example of a specific kind of brain failure. This brain failure is called a type 1 error. It is a larger class.
Sorry, but I really reject your claim that
maybe you should listen to it all the way through before you interrupt.
That most people make up stories. I think that
that's not the claim. Listen to the claim all the way through first. So making up stories of things in the dark is a single example of a larger class of things which has hundreds of thousands of examples, which are called type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 1 and type 2 errors are a thing that happens to every single human brain. And the fact that you make up stories in the dark is a common example to help people understand what this is. It is not required that people make up stories in the dark to experience type 1 and type 2 errors.
Okay. However, you have a major point for the following reason. If it turns out to be the case, and it is absolutely the case, that I would say what is universal is people who have their wits about them and who know that the world is dangerous, especially if you're in certain environments, that if suddenly everything's dark, they're concerned about it. That's just rational. Now, the next point of making up stories. In fact, what we find is that some people make up stories and some people don't. And I would argue that therefore, just as there is pseudoscience and real science, I would say there, some people make up stories and a lot of people don't make up stories. And what I strongly suspect is the people who don't make, and you can't say that, because sometimes in the dark, there really are dangerous things. And so to say that because some people make up stories about things they don't understand, therefore it follows logically that religious, let's say, theologies consist of people making up stories. That is not even, that's like a million miles away from what I would call a strong argument.
My argument isn't making up stories. My argument is confirmation bias, which literally every brain suffers from.
Including yours.
Yes, and faulty generalization, every brain suffers from. Type 1 and type 2 errors, every brain suffers from.
However, what we find is, as in science, that because we are predisposed to confirmation bias, and because we are fallible, therefore
we need some way to filter it out. We need some better method.
And therefore, and I have that as much as you do.
Well, that's what I keep asking you. What is I have a method of novel predictions. Mine works. What is your method? Because your method that you've described so far is that it's a thing a lot of people believe, built a successful culture, and the smart people believed it. And those are the only things you provided. All of those are fallacious.
No, sorry. I never presented that as a methodology. That was anecdotal. If you want a methodology, here it is. I would say that ultimately, everyone, including you, including me, tends to make judgments based on deep intuitions. And so in my case, I joined a spiritual movement. I was taught a lot of things. Some of them I believed are true. I still believe, and some of them I questioned. I didn't just I wasn't just like a theological omnivore. I questioned, I doubted. In fact, in one of our main texts, the text I translated, actually, at least part of it, an ancient Sanskrit text, it says that the first symptom of intelligence is doubt. The first symptom of intelligence is doubt. For example, I was skeptical about materialism. I was also skeptical about fanatical religion. To me, they were two extremes, neither of which I accepted. And so I have made my way, in my view, rationally. I read things in books, or people tell me things, or I listen to preachers, and some of it I take as correct. And if something doesn't make sense to me, I keep working on it. I keep thinking. I don't accept things blindly. Everything that I accept.
What's the method? How do you use a method, and can we show that method works? Because my method we can show, novel testable predictions. That's a way to.
My method consists of the two main epistemological methodologies, which are foundationalism and coherentism. Foundationalism means that every system of knowledge, empirical, theological, whatever it is, it's based on certain fundamental assumptions which strike the person holding that view as self-evident. They prove themselves. They don't require, that what comes from Aristotle, by the way. So for example, we could talk about solipsism. You can't really prove that, as Descartes said, that you're not a brain in the laboratory of an evil genius imagining you have a podcast or something.
Well, so let's take that example. So the belief that I think there's an external world has a lot of evidence. Belief there's a God has zero evidence. So I
No.
can give good reason to believe there's an external world.
However, the evidence, you see, the evidence, if you want to avoid circularity, we're talking about the foundation. The foundation is you accept the world as real, like I do,
Yes.
because you experience the world in such a way that it proves itself to you that it's real. Because no, because any particular sensation, like you drink a cup of water, you touch something, you hear something, that's all circular because that all is based on the assumption there's a real world. For example,
but none of that's a part of my evidence. So my evidence that there's an external world is that I can create beliefs and methods that say if my idea corresponds to the things I'm experiencing, I should be able to make predictions about my future experiences. And if I get those right, that's a good reason to believe whatever led me to that belief.
That totally doesn't address the point.
No, it does, because this my belief in the it does.
It's internal.
That's fine. It doesn't need to not be internal.
Yeah, it does. I'll explain why. Because I don't think you're really grasping the point of foundationalism. In other words, it's possible. I don't think it's really possible, but let's say it's logically possible. It's logically possible that let's say Descartes' evil genius has created a world, or let's say an imaginary world, a hallucinogenic world. And in that hallucinogenic world, all the laws of nature are uniform and they all work, in quote unquote scientific way. So foundationalism is not talking about, see, what you're talking about is coherentism. You're not talking about foundationalism.
What I said was neither of those. Epistemic foundations and methodologies are two separate categories. I am a foundationalist, but my foundation is I think, therefore I am. That's my foundation. There's nothing else in there. That's it. From that, I can say there's some difference between the kinds of experiences I have. If I imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn. So there's two classes of things there, the imaginary and the experiential, and I need a method to differentiate which experiences are of the imaginary kind and the experiential kind.
You're really not addressing my point.
No, I'm getting there. So this is the second step. The third step is, in order to differentiate the imagination from the reality, you need to have a hypothesis. And if that hypothesis can accurately predict future experiences, that's evidence. It's not proof. You don't need to prove we're not a brain in a vat. That's evidence which gives you reason to believe the hypothesis. So if you believe there's an external world, and if you believe because there's an external world, tomorrow the sun's going to rise, and it does, that's evidence that you're in the external world.
However, it doesn't address the case where you're a brain in a vat.
It does.
No, I'll explain why. Because you're a brain in a vat, and the world that is being presented to you neurologically is a world of complete uniformity. And so therefore
I did address that. So like, if I suppose I'm in a brain in a vat, but I believe I'm in the external world, and I say, if I'm in the external world, the sun will rise tomorrow, and I see the sun rise, my belief that there's an external world has evidence. I'm justified in believing there's an external world, even if there's not.
You see, you're still not going down to the foundation. That's not foundationalism.
My foundationalism is I think, therefore I am. There's nothing more in my foundationalism. That's the entirety of my foundationalism.
Well, fine. But what I'm saying is that if it were the case that the evil genius, Descartes' evil genius, with a technology far beyond what we have today, created a world in your mind.
Yes, I would be wrong, but it would still be evidence.
Of complete regularity. It gets to the Gaudiya problem, where you can have a justified true belief.
Justified false belief. It would be false. So if I have a belief that I'm in the external world, and it's justified because I have evidence from novel predictions, but I'm in a brain in a vat, it would be false. It would be a justified false belief.
For example, let's say I'm having a dream. And in my dream, the laws of nature operate as they usually do. There's nothing psychedelic in my dream. I'm just having a dream, and just the normal laws of nature are operating. And then I wake up, and then I'm not trying to prove, by the way, there's no physical world. And then I wake up from my dream, and I see, well, that was a dream. Now, you can't empirically prove that the world you see when you're awake is more real than the world of your dream. You can't empirically prove that, but that's the case.
You don't need to prove it. You can have evidence of that. So if you say the world is external and it's real.
No, I'm saying but in the dream world, the laws of nature were operating normally.
Right. And so you could have evidence that the external world is real, even though you're in a dream.
However, what I'm saying is logically,
let me try to explain this to you better. So I have a method, and I can apply this method whether I'm in a dream or I'm in Descartes' demon or the world is real. And if the method works, then I have a reason to trust that method. Doesn't matter if I'm right. I could be completely wrong. My method could be totally wrong, but it's still evidence. So I have a reason, I have justification
but
to
on
believe
those
there's an external.
grounds,
Wait. You don't have a method. You have not provided a method.
well,
I
if
have
you,
a method. One sec.
Yeah.
I have a method that I can use to justify my beliefs that can do a good job of differentiated imagination from reality as far as I can tell. So I have a reason to believe there's an external world because I can apply a method to it. You haven't given me a method.
Okay,
So
I'll give you one.
Okay.
I'll give you one. First of all, in my epistemic system, there are true intuitions, and I can experience things as real, which are not simply empirical. And yet I can experience them as real because I have the power to do so. And you see, I think we have to distinguish here between a magical world and a mystic world. A magical world like Harry Potter is not, things don't obey all kinds of laws. It's just a magical world. So I've been living my life for well over 50 years based on certain principles, and I live in a completely rational world, spiritual context, which is completely rational, in which causes and effects follow perfectly according to what I thought they should, the way they should. And I'm proceeding. It doesn't in any way disable me in terms of functioning at a very good level in the material world. I've been very successful in my, let's say, external life as well. I know how to keep my bank accounts, and I know how to keep myself healthy, and I know how to, keep friends and everything. So all the usual ways you measure, like, are you a functional human being? Are you having a good life? I'd say, yeah, I'm having a great life in the material world. But at the same time, I have a spiritual life. And so if you say that intuitions are just like leprechauns or something, then of course the whole thing just collapses. But what I'm saying is that there are spiritual systems which are not empirical, but in which there's constant confirmation. Things proceed in an orderly way by cause and effect. And one can directly experience that in a way which is absolutely undeniable. And the fact that some people don't have that experience doesn't mean it's not true. It means they just don't have that experience. There's no law, there's no objective law that atheists can simply declare that unless I experience it, it's not true. I mean, it's not true for you. I totally understand it's not true for you, but that doesn't mean it's not true. It's just not something that you've experienced, and therefore it's not something which you are justified in believing. But I'm absolutely justified. In fact, I would say that my spiritual experiences, if anything, are epistemically more powerful than even such simple things as, like, I'm in the world, I'm touching this object. I mean, I've had spiritual experiences which, by Aristotle's standard, are absolutely self-evident to me. And just hypothetically, this is hypothetical. If it were the case that there's a God, and if it were the case that God is inclined to make himself, herself, themself, whatever, not going to do the pronouns, if that God were inclined to make itself, whatever, known, and obviously has the power, but God to make himself known under certain appropriate circumstances, and some people actually do get that knowledge, and they know it as much or more than they know anything else, then they're epistemically justified. And that epistemic justification does not require that people who don't have the experience consent or agree to it.
Right, but I don't care about the people who don't have the experience. For it to be justified for you, you need to have a method that
I do have a method.
Wait.
It's called Bhakti Yoga. I do have a method.
One sec. So that hasn't been proven to be faulty. So if your method is intuition, and we know intuition fails, your method fails.
No, we know that empiricism fails, but some empiricism is correct.
To say anything about empiricism?
No. To say that all intuitions, there's only one kind of intuition, and that is the fallible kind. So because some claims that some people made to have intuitive knowledge, because it turned out not to be true, Therefore, no one has correct intuition. That's absurd.
No. The claim here is that intuitions are not on their own reliable. No matter what intuitions, they are not on their
That's
own
absurd.
reliable,
That's
and you
absurd.
need intuition plus something else.
No. For example, I have an intuition. I have an intuition that it's wrong to kill innocent people.
Right, and that's not good enough on its own. You need something else.
No, I don't. What else do I need?
Something that isn't fallibly terrible at basis for evidence.
No. You see, first of all, in the Gita, there's a distinction. People are in different levels of consciousness. So, for example, some people think that science is all a conspiracy and a plot. And so the fact that some people feel a certain way about, that's their intuition, that science is evil, the devil made science. So, but that's an intuition. So the fact that there are different levels, everyone's not equal. People are in different levels of consciousness. Intuitions may be enlightened and they may be unenlightened. So you can't say.
What method do you have to differentiate enlightened versus unenlightened intuitions? Because as far as I can tell, all intuitions on their own give us no way to differentiate which intuitions are right or wrong, because that would be begging the question, as you mentioned.
No.
So in order to establish which intuitions are good ones and which are bad, you need some kind of a reliable method, based on intuitions.
The method is parallel to the method of distinguishing good empiricism from bad empiricism. Because as we know, in the name of empiricism, all kinds of nonsense has been propagated.
I'm not an empiricist, so I don't know why you keep bringing that up. My method is novel testable prediction. So I can say whatever your beliefs are, if you can accurately predict the future and get it right, that justifies those beliefs.
Okay, I'll do it that way then. I withdraw my empiricist remark. When I began the process that I'm involved in, there was literature, philosophy that said that if you engage in this practice, these things will happen. And in fact, they did happen precisely. And they were all extremely beneficial, very enlightening, and I think in every possible way made me a better person once I got past my initial, sort of fanatical conversion experience phase. So
that's prediction. That's great. But were they novel?
Were they novel? In what sense?
New things, like if I predict the sun.
Oh, absolutely. Like there were things that, in fact, it's not that I became attached to a certain theory or dogma or theology, and then I, did something to believe it. No, because I would say that, let's say if you're born in a certain tradition, perhaps, and then you're predisposed to believe certain things are true, and then you have experiences and you tend to interpret them through that lens. Of my experience is completely different. I'd never heard of this before. To me, this was something completely new, had nothing to do with my upbringing, had nothing to do with my college education.
Well, I don't mean new for you. I mean new in reality. So like if somebody predicts the sun is going to, or what was it? There was Columbus went to the Native Americans and he says, in 3 weeks, the moon will block the sun. Now, Columbus already knew about lunar cycle. So he knew it was going to happen. The Native Americans didn't. And so the fact that he was able to predict it was new for them, but it wasn't new. It was already known by people in the world. And so for you to have evidence of your hypothesis, what you need is a prediction about something in the world that we don't know yet. Nobody knows yet, and be able to get it right.
No, I don't. It's actually the opposite. It's just like in a science class, they say, okay, this little experiment's been done 1 million times. Now you do it. And by doing it, you see that there are certain relevant laws of nature which are valid because this experiment worked. What I adopted in my life was a tradition coming down from thousands of years, in which many hundreds of millions of people had adopted a particular methodology and achieved very powerful spiritual results. I was told in the literature I read, that if you do certain things, your life will dramatically improve in certain ways, and you will get a certain understanding that you didn't have before, and you will have it by direct experience. You will experience it in a way which is undeniable, which is self-evident. And that's exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. In fact, if my experience had not matched what I was told, I probably wouldn't be having this conversation with you.
Well, the question is...
So what I'm saying is we have to have universal principles here. In other words, I don't want our conversation to tilt toward the atheist side in this sense. When I say things like confirmation, Like, here's a theory, here's the confirmation of the theory. We're not going to a priori say that the model for that is in the material world. To me, these are universal principles, but sometimes take a physical form or material form, and sometimes they may take a spiritual form.
Well,
And
that's
so,
fine. I'm fine with my method works equally as well under materialism or spiritualism or idealism. They apply to all of them. So my method doesn't say anything about materialism. It
okay,
just says able to make novel testable predictions and gets them right. And if you get them right,
yes, but
any
novel,
belief you have is
no, but
justified.
novel, but you see, the point of novel is there, to me, doesn't sound rational.
Well, okay, let me help you with that one. If I predict the sun will rise tomorrow because of the spaghetti monster, is that evidence of the spaghetti monster?
No,
Why?
because we already know that the sun has, rises.
Right. So we would need something that we don't already know.
No, but you see, but the evidence that to me closed the deal, so to speak, to use crass capitalistic language, the evidence that I was on the right path was not that a material prediction was made. In fact, there are religions which I think,
Well, I didn't say anything about material prediction. So material is not a part of this.
there were, what was novel for me was I personally came to a very significantly higher state of consciousness. And by higher state of consciousness, I mean things like I stopped trying to exploit people. I found I became free of a lot of my sort of stupid vanity. I became a better person, and I just, in every measurable way, I think I just became a better person. And apart from those behavioral things, my knowledge, I became aware of a metaphysical background in which the entire universe exists, which I experienced in such a powerful, self-evident way that it would be grossly irrational for me to deny it or to attribute it to like the tooth fairy or leprechauns, because it was just, I mean, in the same way that I know that I'm talking to you right now, I'm not a general skeptic, I'm not a solipsist. In the same way that I take this world as real, so I have, it's like Plato discussed this. I mean, I have a capacity, and you do. I think any sane human being has a certain capacity to distinguish that this is really happening to me.
Well, that's the part I'm lost on, because how do we distinguish between you saying you had an experience and it changed your life and you became aware of metaphysical truths with literally all of the crazy people who say the exact same thing about things that are ridiculous and that we both reject?
Like what?
Like Scientology, Mormonism, Christianity, Islam,
Okay,
Jainism.
wait a second. What I would say is this. It's well known that in, let's say, public schools, they're still teaching science, which is kind of like, in some cases, 100 years behind the times, in some cases, only 50 years behind the times. I listen to lectures by scientists, like real scientists, and it's very common. They'll say, of course, this is probably isn't what you learned in school, but this is what we now know. And so, and so the point is that in both in the field of science and I would say in the theological field, there are some people, like take Christianity. I would say the reason Christianity survived, in my view, this is the historical speculation, to the extent that it is maybe not entirely the view, because they got certain things right. They got certain things right. And so, and the analogy with science there is, if some kids in school, let's say in public school, 10th grade, 7th grade, whatever, and they're learning a lot of science, including a lot of stuff which actually science no longer accepts because they've gone beyond that. But the point is, the basic scientific method and a lot of the basic facts are still true, and therefore it's still being taught. So I would say that there's a human condition where if you're presented a worldview, if enough of it is correct and some of it is a little wacky, then still there's a tendency for many people just sort of go with the package because it has enough truth in it and there's enough benefit in it. And I think that's true for science, it's true for theology. So it doesn't.
Well, let me use an analogy here. So with the example of Columbus I gave, Columbus said he's going to predict that the moon's going to block out the sun in 2 weeks. From the Native Americans' perspective, that's something new. That's really impressive. And so they're rational to believe that Columbus knows something about the universe they don't. But if then they talk with other other people from the new world or whatever, and they realize, oh, everybody knows that, and that's something that's taught in schools. Now, do you think they should doubt Columbus? They shouldn't believe in Columbus anymore because what he said doesn't matter. This is common knowledge that was already known, and so Columbus isn't special, right?
Of course.
So in the case of religious belief and religious testimony, having something that powerfully transforms your life may to you initially seem really special, but we already have an explanation for that that has been demonstrated with lots of different evidence that it happens to lots of different people. It has nothing to do with the religious belief. It has to do with social, culturals, and emotional dopamine levels.
You've given an extremely exaggerated view. It hasn't been proved. It hasn't been proved that, I mean, some people who are not religious have changes of life.
Yes, from football, from sports, from video games, from
however, I mentioned the changes in my life not as the ultimate proof, like that's why I believe it. Even if my life did change, if I had not personally experienced in a very powerful way the truth of certain theological claims, I would not have stayed around and practiced this just because, okay, it took me off, I'd given up some of my bad habits, I become a nicer person. That wouldn't have kept me around. I just would have said, thanks a lot. You guys helped me. I'm glad I was able to do some service, like to reciprocate. I served your mission for a while. I'm moving on now. Because my main motive was knowledge. My main motive wasn't to clean up my life because I wasn't evil. I wasn't a drug addict. I wasn't a rapist. I mean, I wasn't like an evil person. I had some bad habits, but I wasn't looking for that. I mean, that's actually not what I was looking for. I was looking for knowledge, and specifically, I was not looking for a theory. I was not looking for just a theology. I wanted to experience it because those are the days, of experience, and people are.
Well, so I understand what you're saying, but the direct experience of the theological truths is the hypothesis. That's the first thing. And we want to know, is this hypothesis real or imaginary? And so in order to know if it's real or imaginary, you just have the intuition it's true. And then we need something more. We need a methodology to say, is this real or imaginary? And the methodology that you provided was it changed your life or something.
No, we don't. You see, because you're rejecting Aristotle's point of self-evident knowledge. Some things do not require an extraneous, an extrinsic system of proof. That's the whole point that's what the philosophical term self-evident means. As in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And so what you're doing is rejecting the notion that some experiences are self-evident. And I'm saying, I accept the notion that some experiences are self-evident. In fact, I think that's what I've read different accounts of foundationalism. And I think
foundationalism just means you have a starting point, and that starting point could be anything.
I know, but I am a critic. I think that in the last, I don't know, a few centuries or whatever it is, I think that Western philosophers, not all of them, but a lot of them have trivialized the real notion of foundationalism. And so when I use the word foundationalism, I mean, you brought up a reasonable objection, but so therefore I have to clarify that I don't mean foundationalism in the, frankly, somewhat trivial sense, in my view, that it's come to mean. And so I'm using it in a much more robust sense, that there are some experiences which are so powerful that they are self-evident to that observer.
Right. And so my objection to that was that we have defeaters. We've proven that wrong because of the tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, illusions.
You don't have defeaters. You see, what you're doing is what you're constantly doing is taking what I'm saying, putting it in this huge category, and pointing out that in that category, some of these views have been defeated. Therefore, everything in the category has been defeated without any serious attention to relevant differences, which can be historical, which can be psychological, which can be existential. So you're just making these big, broad categories. Everything gets thrown into that box. And since some items in the box have been defeated, the whole box, everything in the box is invalid. And I'm saying that, no, those are very gross generalizations. And
well, the relevant differences you seemed to have brought up were, one was that it's a powerful experience, which we know those can be wrong. They're wrong all the time. That it has a powerful impact on people and builds a strong culture. We know those are wrong all the time. That
They're not
it's
wrong all the time. No, I would say they're not wrong all the time.
like
Because no, I'd say they're not wrong. I don't
cosmic zombie Jew, talking donkey, talking snake, world
no, I don't
flooded.
believe it. I don't believe that these, very exotic examples you like to give, they're actually they're entertaining. But I don't believe that these examples can be shown historically to have sustained civilizations.
I don't understand what that means. Like, the fact that something sustains a civilization is something we also know has been proven false. Like, there are many things that sustain civilizations, like Mayans sacrificing virgins to a volcano, that
No,
really
no.
don't
Actually, what we
true.
find is because we know more about the Aztecs. I'll take the Aztecs. The Mayans are still not as well known. In the case of the Aztecs, who were performing human sacrifices, as we know, in the tops of pyramids, and in fact, most of the people in the region hated them, and they maintained their hegemony by brute force. That's one of the reasons Cortez, with a small group of people, won, because he so easily gathered allies from other people in that region who hated the Aztecs.
All civilizations that thrived were done by brute force. So I don't understand the relevance
I
here.
don't believe that. I don't think you could prove that for all civilizations. I mean, I think that you can't confuse two things here. You could have a civilization in which people actually buy into the culture, people actually believe in certain norms. However, inevitably in any culture, some people will violate those norms, some people will do bad things, and
So
therefore
just the criteria you're saying, the differentiating factor is that there is some belief that sustains a culture without brute force, and whatever
no,
this is, these are reasonable.
no, it's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the fact that a civilization uses violence, state violence, can be police, it can be an army, to defend what they consider to be their civilization, that alone does not mean that a majority of people in that civilization are following the rules of the civilization because of the force. It could be a case.
The force thing isn't. So I'm going back to the argument we were talking about before. You were saying that I wasn't considering differentiating factors between different kinds of intuitions, and you said the important differentiating factor of what makes one intuition trustworthy and the other one not trustworthy is the fact that it's integral to a society and helps it thrive.
No,
And it's
no, I didn't say that. I didn't connect those two things that way.
okay. What is the differentiating? Because that's I'm asking about the differentiating factors. What is the differentiating factors
Okay.
between trustworthy intuitions and garbage?
Okay. Take America, for example, in which there's, currently so many, different views and so on. So what we can find is some people are relatively well informed. They've actually studied the history. They've considered the social science. They've considered international affairs. They may disagree. For example, someone may have a more conservative view. Someone may have a more liberal view. But because they can agree on all kinds of historical facts, which are non-controversial historical facts, and because they can agree to a certain extent on social science and whatever, they may disagree, but there's a conversation. I mean, I grew up at a time when, for example, at the Oxford Union in Oxford, there was a debate, which you can see on YouTube, between William Buckley, who was sort of one of the leading conservative intellectuals at the time, and James Baldwin, who was one of the leading intellectuals in the Black Rights Movement. And so they had this debate, and what was interesting is they actually they were respectful toward each other. They were both gentlemen, and they debated, and they brought up their points. And so what we can see in society is that some people are reasonably well informed and can engage in rational discussion, and some people are hateful on the left and the right, and are not well informed and are not educated, and they make all these accusations. So I mean, you can dignify.
Which one of those is the differentiating factor? Is it the one that educated people believe it, or it's not hateful? Are those the differentiating factors? What are the differentiating factors?
What I'm saying is, among people who claim an intuitive warrant or a personal, self-evident, experiential warrant for a particular metaphysical view. Some of them are thoughtful, and you could say, in the right sense of the word, educated, and some people are not. And so when you take, I think that you can correlate some of the more exotic examples you give, like leprechauns and everything, with educational level and with the ability to reason based on evidence and so on. And so what you keep doing over and over and over again is taking the most egregious examples of a metaphysical belief, and that stands for the entire category of metaphysical beliefs or of or religious beliefs.
Right,
And
right.
so
So what's the difference? I keep doing that because I keep trying to ask you what's the difference
the
between these two
difference
classes you've laid out.
okay, good question. The difference is that there is in fact, there's a word for jnana yoga, sort of spiritual practice of knowledge. My personal experience as someone who's very inquisitive and not at all inclined to blind faith, and someone who's challenged many, like, things, you're supposed to do that and you're not supposed to do that, and I've challenged different things and given arguments and done my own research. So I think there's a way of going on a powerful, self-evident, taking Aristotle very seriously there, a powerful, and taking Jefferson seriously, a powerful self-evident experience, but combining that with reason, with evidence, and not blindly believing, not being fanatical, not believing in leprechauns, but proceeding step by step in a reasonable way based on powerful evidence. Evidence so powerful becomes self-evident. And so to compare that to just some person that believes in leprechauns or whatever, I think is really, it's just like the same thing in science. Everything you're saying, it's like me saying, okay, some people, I know you're not an empiricist now, but it's like me saying that, okay, among people that claim who they are giving scientific evidence, some of them are really good scientists and they're reliable, and some of them are kind of wacky. And that's true, by the way. And so, and saying, well, therefore, all scientists are wacky. Just as in the field of materialism or in the field of people that believe in science, there are all kinds of different kinds of people. Some of them are reasonable, some of them are not. Some of them are
Right. So I would agree, but I can say the reasonable ones, by my definition, use novel testable predictions. The unreasonable ones don't. So I just give you, there's the criteria, novel testable predictions.
But when you say novel, you see, but I think you're confusing two things. You are taking.
No, I'm not asking you to agree with my criteria.
No, but
I want you to give me yours. What is your criterion?
Everything is okay with what you said except novel, because the whole thrust of advancing science is we have a certain body of, let's say, consensus scientific knowledge, and then science, at least, sincere scientists are always trying to push back the boundaries of science, learn new things, and therefore you win a Nobel Prize in physics or in astronomy because of a novel prediction. However, that is not analogous to the whole nature of spiritual knowledge, because
wait. So it's a different question. So the reason I'm
talking about the word novel.
Well, no, I know, but that's not what I was asking. So the reason I gave that was because I can tell you, if you asked me, how do you differentiate good intuitions and bad intuitions? I can say I have a method, novel testable predictions. You don't have to agree. I don't care if you agree, but I'm asking you, what is your method? How do you differentiate the good intuitions from the bad intuitions? And you were talking about there's some difference between rational people using some rational method, but you haven't told me what that is.
Okay, fair enough. I'll suggest a few things. One is, for example, that I think that if a person is on a valid spiritual path, whatever it is, it doesn't matter if someone is on a valid spiritual path, their powers of empathy will increase. And not only, I'm not talking about behavioral symptoms. I'm talking about the way they actually see things. It's not just that they're taught in a church or synagogue or a temple that be nice to everyone, but they actually see a oneness of all living things. It's something they actually perceive. It's a knowledge and not just a learned behavior.
So you're saying that people with more empathy are more likely to have true intuitions?
I'm saying that people who see the oneness of all life, I mean,
Are more likely to have true intuitions.
with obvious differences. I mean, we know there. In fact, the way Krishna puts it in the Gita is that there are obvious differences of species, of gender, of all ethnicities. I mean, there are obvious differences, but there's a background that within those obvious surface differences, there's a oneness of all life. And that's something which can be perceived, it can be self-evidently perceived. And once I am granted or achieve a what to me is a powerfully self-evident vision of reality, that becomes a testing, that becomes something I can use to test other theories. If someone has a religious view in which half the world is evil because or most of the world is evil because they don't belong to our religion, to me, that's very primitive. And so
my question is, you
yes,
think that if somebody believes there is a oneness of life and they have more empathy, that they have a better intuition about understanding reality than someone who doesn't?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so what about people who are very, very evil, but very good at science? It seems like they have very little empathy, but they are much better at describing reality.
No, they're much better at describing empirical reality. The point is that science, because the essence of the empirical method is to study things by controlling them and subjecting them to different kinds of stimuli or whatever, just observing them. Therefore, there's no moral qualification. You don't need to be a good person. I mean, Hitler had his scientists, and they were actually.
So bad people are very good, or can be very good at getting things right about reality that can be tested. And then let's suppose there's this other realm.
No. You're begging the question.
What?
Bad people can be good at testing certain facts in the world when those facts depend upon controlling nature.
That's literally what I said. So again, let me finish this time. Let me finish this time. Let me finish this time. So bad people can be very good at making successful predictions about reality when they can be tested, but there could be more others that we can't test.
Because the reason you didn't satisfy me by that is because you're trying to co-opt the word test. I'm saying there are different ways to test things. For example,
testing is like control. I'm using it as synonymous with what you said is control here. But so let's say there's another realm. You would still need some way to show that other realm, that there are some true facts and false facts about it. And you haven't done that yet. So we have good reason to believe that the psychopaths can accurately describe reality, but you haven't said that the empathy people can describe this other realm. And how do we say if what their descriptions are correct things versus imaginary? How do we tell a difference there?
The same way. Okay. First of all, the word test is kind of what I thought it meant. But anyway, I just looked it up. Here's the point. Here's my view. There is actually a spiritual reality and there is a material reality, and both of them actually obey discernible laws. So just as if someone believes the physical world is real, which I do, I'm sure you do, there's a real physical world.
Sure.
Then there are ways to objectively study that physical world.
Yes.
From my point of view, there is an objective spiritual realm, and there are certain basic principles, certain basic laws, and it is possible to objectively study the spiritual realm. But the difference is that the methodology in some ways is opposite, because when you're studying something by controlling it, that's very different from studying something by having to submit to it.
Well, that's fine. So I'm okay with that. But in the case of the material world, if we want to know if one person's method is right and one person's method is wrong, we can know that because one can predict the future and one can't. Yes. Now, how do we do that for the spiritual realm? How do we tell if this method for the spiritual realm is the right method, this method is the wrong method? How do we tell the difference? Okay.
To some extent, not exactly in the same way on the material side, one can make predictions. And my experience is, for my whole life, that people who sincerely take up certain spiritual methodologies, in fact, those things happen. But that's not the essence of it. I mean, those are just almost like benefits that come with it. But obviously, it is the case with me. There's certain basic spiritual truths, which I think are fundamental. And obviously, in the tradition I'm in, we make certain special, more detailed claims that people in other traditions might not agree on, but we would agree on certain very basic spiritual facts. And therefore, it is, I would evaluate someone's spiritual knowledge or their spiritual consciousness by, behaviorally, you could say, because there is a type of spiritual behaviorism, based on whether they understand certain basic spiritual facts, and if their behavior, and of course, someone can be a hypocrite or someone can accept the philosophy.
Let me ask a different way.
Okay.
Why were the Nazis wrong about the spiritual realm?
Well, I don't think they had a spiritual realm.
Suppose they did. Suppose there's like a group of people who believe in the spiritual and think they should all just kill babies. Why are they wrong? How do you know that they're wrong about the spiritual realm?
Because it's not just this one big blob. We have spiritual beliefs. I think if they had, I think that couldn't happen if someone had correct spiritual beliefs. If someone actually believed.
That's begging the question. So
no, it's
the
not.
question is, how do you know that
no,
their spiritual beliefs are wrong?
It's not begging, it's describing the foundation. I mean, there's an apparent circularity in foundationalism epistemically, but ultimately, because it's not, they're not mutually supporting things. I'm saying there are certain things which are self-evidently true. So, and one of those self-evident truths is that all of us, every living being, ultimately shares the same spiritual nature, and therefore someone in spiritual consciousness, not the same anatomical nature, certainly, and therefore someone in spiritual consciousness would see the value of every living thing. In fact, the word for, what do they call it? They call it
intrinsic?
I forget, there's a philosophical word for it. Biocentrism, I think, is a word one philosopher coined. In other words, I would say that every living being deserves moral consideration, because every living being because life itself is ultimately spiritual and not physical, that our bodies are simply conducting and providing a mechanism through which life can manifest and consciousness can manifest, but matter itself is never living. And therefore, if someone does not recognize the ultimate value of all living things, then I would say whatever that person claims, that person does not have much spiritual understanding.
Okay, but based on what? So there's many different ideologies that glorify evil. Why are they wrong?
They're wrong. They're wrong because I would say that ultimately, not the nature of reality when it's transparently perceived, when people are in their right state of mind. I mean, there's all kinds of stories of crazy people that go and, stab someone to death because, it's some lunatic, and then they go to some psychiatric prison for the rest of their life. I mean, people can think that they should do all kinds of things. And I think people like Putin, really, should be in a psychiatric prison or something. So I think that when you see, it's like when you see, let's say if your eyes are functioning properly, you perceive the sky as blue. And if you can't see the sky, or if you think, so we can talk about people being, I don't know, you call it neurologically kind of basically in good shape. And so they can measure distances, they can drive a car. They're not impaired in a way they can't. So in the same way, there is an objective spiritual reality. And therefore there can be a whole spiritual science built around, because you can't have a material science unless you have a law-abiding physical nature.
Well, there's many evil people who are very brilliant. Joseph Goebbels, very brilliant.
Yeah.
Goebbels. But so there's the fact that they have a very well-functioning mind doesn't seem to correspond to them being moral. But if I wanted to say, if you asked me, how would I tell the difference between this person's methodology and this person's, who's right? I'd say novel predictions. Whichever one can predict the future is the right one. Very simple, very easy.
But no, that's not the way it's done.
For me it is, but I'm asking for you. For you,
but
if we give Joseph Goebbels versus you,
logically, no, because take Goebbels, who obviously, unfortunately had a rather evil incarnation. If you take Goebbels, he obviously fails almost practically all the spiritual tests. And so it's just like methodology. For example,
what are the tests? So like my test is novel predictions. What are your tests?
My tests are that there's certain basic spiritual facts in the universe. And that if people in any tradition or in no tradition, actually someone could even just not even be a theist in any tradition at all. Like, for example, the Jainism.
What are the tests? How can I know that
I'm getting wrong? I'm getting to that. Jainism, it's fun talking to you. Jainism, for example, believed in an eternal soul, but no God. They were atheists, but they believed in an eternal soul. So that people at a certain stage of purity, it's like water. Water, if water is transparent, you can see through it. If consciousness is transparent, you can see what's actually there spiritually. And so what's actually there is that there is a unity of life, ultimately, not in our present physical condition. We're obviously very different. And I don't mean a oneness. I don't mean we all merge into each other either. I think, individuality is permanent. But the point, so if someone like Goebbels clearly has no clue about the unity of life and despises and wants to murder people who are, physically or culturally different from him, then he totally fails a test. There are tests. If you have, even say theoretically, just to set up the system, because you keep asking for a system, which you have a right to do. If it's the case that there is a spiritual reality, and if that spiritual reality manifests according to certain principles, certain high principles, and the extent to which people, and you could observe those principles, frankly, in theologies all around the world, not all of them necessarily, but you can observe them throughout human history, that human beings, at least at a certain level of evolution of consciousness, have come to these same conclusions. And so therefore, there's an objective spiritual reality. People in an appropriate state of consciousness can perceive them. They agree on that. The Greco-Roman civilization took that as a given, that there is such a thing. You had a whole civilization, which was, and therefore someone's behavior is completely in violation of these universal principles, then it's assumed that person is not at all in a spiritual state of consciousness.
So I don't see how that method works. So I understand how my method works. My method works is if somebody understands reality better, they will be able to describe future events better. But yours is something like if someone understands the spiritual realm better, they will understand the oneness of life or something.
And people, when you have communities of people who share those views, in other words, I don't know, this whole thing about predicting, you're trying to take some of the basic principles of empiricism and say that every system of knowledge, that empiricism is the universal template for knowledge. If you claim you've got a knowledge system, you have to be like empiricism. And I'm saying that's nonsense. I don't, no one appointed you or any other atheist, no one appointed you to be the gatekeeper of objectivity.
Right. So I agree there. So what I'm doing here is I'm contrasting my method, which is novel testable predictions. It's clear, it's concise, it's easy to understand. You can understand how it responds to reality, and then comparing it to yours, which is oneness and stuff, which doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
You're creating there's a straw man argument. What I'm doing is I'm saying everything you have on the material side, which by the way is a side I also believe in and I'm grateful for, because I've benefited enormously in my life because of material science. So I'm not a science denier. I don't see science as evil. I see it as a great blessing. But the point is, everything that you've got on the one side, you also have on the other side, but you are skeptical about whether that side really exists. And so the failure of the spiritual science is not due to any internal contradiction. It's due to your skepticism about the basic principles of it. But if those basic principles are true, the rest follows consistently and coherently.
Well, I'm not interested in the principles. I'm interested in the method. I want to know, like, if I
The
apply the
method,
novel
the
testable
method,
predictions method, it
the
fails. So if
method.
I think my novel testable predictions method should be applied to everything, and when
No,
it's applied to the
everything
spiritual,
is
it
because
fails.
because everything is not a controllable physical object.
Well, that's fine, but you would need to provide a different method that works equally as well
I
as
have
mine.
provided it for thousands and thousands of intelligent people
Well, wait,
who are
is it that oneness thing? If you see oneness, is this the method, the seeing oneness?
not just, I mean, obviously there are further differentiations. It's not a, I'm just saying oneness in a, not in a crude sense, but just in a very general sense. There are further distinctions. There's all kinds of nuances and other facts. But I'm saying basically to have universal empathy, which derives not from accepting a doctrine, like, okay, I believe in the credo, but it derives from an actual vision. There is a, from our point of view, there is a spiritual realm. It is a lawful realm, just like the material universe is a lawful realm. There are people who advance in their understanding of it. The people who are advancing tend to all agree with each other as much as scientists agree with each other, not the fanatics. But I have no problems. You see, I think there's a basic distinction. There's tribal monotheism, for example, and there's philosophical monotheism. The philosophical monotheists agree on a million things. The tribal monotheists, where I think in a primitive state of consciousness, as all forms of tribalism are primitive, don't. And so you can't keep taking the worst forms. So you're doing two things, in my view. Number one, you're taking the worst examples of religiosity. And number two, you're arguing against spiritual science as if, well, since those things don't really exist anyway, or since they can't be empirically shown to exist, you can't claim there's a spiritual science based on things which I don't believe in.
Well,
But
I'm not doing either of those things. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I really understand novel testable predictions. I understand how they work. I understand the methodology. I understand what it says. I don't understand oneness. So when you say oneness is as good as testable predictions, that doesn't make sense to me. That's like
I'll give you
saying
an analogy.
replicons.
I'll give you an analogy. I'll give you an analogy. And these are analogies from the material realm, but I think they help us to get at it. Take, for example, a really good sports team
Sure.
where the people on the team, they're obviously individual human beings, but the people on the team have really come to a level of consciousness where they're entirely playing as a team. They feel that it's a team. They're feeling teamness. And this gets back to the basic academic point that sociology cannot be reduced down just to the sum of psychologies. And so there is a group consciousness. It can be a team, it can be a family, it can be a marriage, it can be many things where human beings really feel one. So that in a family, in a good family, and I was fortunate, I think, to be born in a good family, if anyone in the family is in trouble in some way, it's a problem for the whole family. The whole family comes together and they really feel like we have to fix this. So there's a type of that kind of oneness. Not an ontological, well, even ontology, you could say that, but in any case, I won't get into the whole ontology of oneness, but a oneness in the sense where that's what empathy means. Let's say I'm looking at you and you're not just the completely other, you're not radically different. I can understand there's a sense in which we're the same kind of thing. We're both souls. And therefore, just as I care about myself and my self-interest, I care about my family, I care about my friends, and let's say in some way I care about you because of identification. That's what identification means. I can see myself in you, and I can see you in myself. That empathy, that understanding, and I mean, which is
You can't see that in me. I do not understanding, not a thing I'm feeling. So from my worldview, somebody is right if they can predict the future more accurately, more often.
addiction is not.
Wait. This. I'm just comparing these to try and
Go ahead.
understand. In your worldview, somebody's more right if they feel more sense of oneness.
Say it again, please.
So in my worldview, someone is more right if they can more often predict the future. In your worldview, somebody is more right if they feel more of a sense of oneness.
That's just one symptom. It's if the ability to empathize with all living things is a symptom, it's a characteristic of knowledge. It's not the whole thing. It's just one symptom. There are other symptoms. And so, yeah. And so if it's the case, as in the Avatar movie, if it's the case that there's actually a unity of life, there's some way in which all living things are somehow united, ultimately from the highest perspective, then the ability to recognize that is a symptom of higher consciousness. And it's something which, frankly, there is huge agreement on among people in many different spiritual traditions. And there are also fanatics in every tradition, including mine, who don't see it that way. And so therefore, thinking that, for example, men and women are just different, period. That's like the final word on it. They're just different. People of different races, people of different ethnicities, people of different nationalities, different ages, they're just different, period, is a lower state of consciousness than seeing that, okay, different ages, races, ethnicities, even species, but there's a sense in which there's a unity of life. That's a higher understanding.
Okay, so that helps a little bit. We're making some bit of progress there. So in my worldview, predictions tell us about reality because we're very bad at predicting the future. And so if you can do that, your idea must be more than just imagination, because imagination is very bad at predicting the future. And that's why predictions give us a reason to think that that person is right about reality. Now, how does oneness tell us about the spiritual reality, like testable predictions tells us about the physical reality?
Okay. First of all, just give one simple example that, what's his name? My God, that Irish philosopher, common sense philosophy, Sir Thomas Reid, has an argument against Hume's skepticism about causality. And Reid said that that someone could say that, well, the day always follows night, therefore night causes day. So there are conjunctions. Okay, I won't go there. It's just making things worse. So what you wanted to know, please repeat. I'm sorry, that was kind of I'll keep it.
Yeah, the reason I think testable predictions tell us about who is right is because we are very bad at telling the future. And so if somebody has some ideas that can accurately predict the future, that's a good reason that those ideas are better than the just imaginary ones.
Yeah. Although it's also true that there are many examples in science where they had a theory and it worked to some extent, and predicting the future turned out to be wrong.
So how does oneness work like testable predictions? How does oneness tell us about the spiritual realm in the same way that novel prediction tells us about the physical realm?
Because there are certain things which are metaphysical, not empirical, that if someone not only espouses it, but actually their behavior is completely consistent, it's obvious they're not just faking it, they really are seeing it, then that is evidence that someone is just like, let's say you take a biology test and you answer certain questions, the teacher reads the answers and says those are the right answers. So if someone claims to see things a certain way and their behavior is completely consistent with what they claim to be the case, then we assume, to the best of our knowledge, that person is seeing things that way, and that is a higher understanding. Whereas not seeing that, because someone in that higher understanding, the oneness of life, obviously, can stop at a red light and go to green light. I mean, they see everything in the empirical realm to the extent their senses are functioning properly, and to the extent that they've learned a bit about it. So it doesn't preclude that. So you have all the empirical knowledge, you accept the empirical knowledge, you take advantage of applied science, whether it's dentistry or whatever, but at the same time, you see that there's a background, a spiritual background. So it includes the empirical and goes beyond it. And as far as the fact is, the reason that not no one, okay, take out the hyperbole. The reason that the majority of people don't feel they need permission from empirical proof is because of their experience. And those experiences vary according to the level of purity of the consciousness, just like water in different states of purity, water is more or less transparent. And so there are predictions about when your consciousness is transparent. You will see certain things. And people all around the world for many, many thousands of years, not the religious fanatics, not the superstitious people with their leprechauns, but the philosophers and the people who tried to be rational and were very intelligent. And they've come to certain agreements across space and time about the nature of higher consciousness. I've engaged in a spiritual practice. I've had amazing confirmation. These things are really true. They really exist. They're self-evident. And I don't have to prove that to anyone. I mean, and if people are willing to undergo the process, like take Einstein's physics. I mean, a very tiny, tiny percentage of the people in the world can actually work out the equations for themselves. And everybody else, I mean, almost 99.9% of the people in the world take it on faith that Einstein was right. And so the way the real, so this, anyway, I'm going all over the place here, but yeah, we do have a system. It is rational. It doesn't mean it's true. You know, it's just, let's say it's logically consistent. Even if it's untrue, it's logically consistent. It's had tremendous appeal throughout space and time, throughout civilizations all around the world. I have personal, powerful experience of it, that it is true. And I got everything I need. I don't see what's missing in my life, because someone who doesn't believe in these things doesn't believe it. Okay, you know, I wish you did, but I don't, you know, I'm not going to, you know, imagine that I'm going to persuade you. So, but I have a great life. And a lot of people I know have a great life, and we're experiencing this incredible reality, and there's nothing missing for us. We're just, you know, going further, and our life gets better and better. What can I say?
Well, I would say that if we contrast that as your methodology and say mine is the guy who can predict the future more accurately is better, I think my methodology is a better one.
But you would have to justify future prediction as the test.
Yeah, that's because of what I said before, that we're very bad at predicting the future. And so the very few good ideas that can are more likely to correspond to reality than all of the bad ideas that can't.
I could just as easily say that we're bad at getting into truly higher consciousness. The political situation in this country right now, in which you have, you know, these different groups hating each other, and just like, you know, who needs a constitution? If I can just get rid of my enemies, that, you know, even if we have to, you know, the constitution collapses, who cares? What I'm saying, and I'm not talking about one side or the other, what I'm saying is it's just as difficult. There are many false predictions. Science has made, you know, many predictions which were false, and many predictions that are true. And I give credit to science that there's at least still enough integrity in the scientific community that the true predictions tend to win out. And so, but again, you have borrowed a methodology, or taken one from the empirical realm and said that this is universal. It's not universal. Predicting, although we have predictions. I mean, it was predicted something would happen in my life. I would learn certain things. I would come to experience, and I did experience them. And they're self-evident truths. So, I mean, we could talk about predictions too. That may not be available to you because you've chosen that that's not your path. Fine. You know, it's a free world. But the point is, I was told that if you engage in this process, you will come to see and understand all kinds of things. It's like if you're pre-med in college, and you're told if you just follow this pre-med course and then go to medical school, you will learn everything you need to know to be a doctor. And if you're a reasonable student and you go to a, you know, decent school, it actually happens. That's exactly what happened in my case. If you take to this path, you will come to personally experience in a self-evident, irrefutable way certain powerful truths about reality. It happened. And it's happening to people all around me, and they're really happy, and they have great lives. And so that didn't happen for you. It's not something you believe. It's not something you're going to choose. You know, that I respect your free will. I respect your independence, but it's absolutely happening for us, and it's available to other people. So, you know, the material, here, just say hypothetically, if it's true, as our books of wisdom teach, that actually the spiritual realm is a higher realm. Because, and in fact, it's sort of Neoplatonic, that the material world is actually kind of like a reflection of the real world. So in that case, we would expect that the methodology for reaching the higher knowledge is more demanding than the methodology for reaching the physical knowledge. Because as you said, and as I agree, there isn't really any, let's say, discernible moral requirement to be a scientist. We hope scientists are not evil, like Hitler's scientists, but you can be a good scientist even if you're a jerk. And so, but you can't be a jerk and get spiritual knowledge. So in that sense, it's more demanding, which doesn't mean it's less objective. To say that something is more demanding or has certain moral requirements which are not present in other fields doesn't mean it's less a science. It just means it's more demanding.
Unless it's wrong.
I know you think that, and I know
that brings up Tim West asked a question.
Sure.
How could you discover that you were wrong about your self-evident truths?
Okay. I think the same way I could discover I'm wrong about an empirical truth. If evidence was presented to me which refuted what I previously thought was true. So now I'm living in a certain spiritual worldview. And if I had an experience which was self-evident to me or somehow could be proved to me that, well, you thought this, but actually it's not true. And I'd have to experience another truth which clearly is superior. I mean, even in the tradition I'm in, I'm actually known as a skeptic. You know, it's ironic in this context. But there are many things I was taught, like, I mean, these are trivial things, but like you have to dress a certain way, or you have to perform certain rituals, or that, you know, even things about like almost similar to leprechauns. I have to give you credit for that, you know. So, and those things, I just said, no, I mean, it makes no sense to me. And I've only accepted those things that do make sense to me. And many, many people who tend to be educated people, who tend to be more thoughtful people, agree with me. So I don't have an uncritical, omnivorous approach to an ancient tradition. But so if you can show me a truth that I can experience, not just an argument like, well, you can't predict the future, so you haven't got a real science, that's not persuasive. But if I have an experience of something which shows that what I thought was true is not, then I would be morally required to adopt the new knowledge.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about 2.5 hours. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, I do have a website, which a lot of your fans may not find fascinating, but it's hdgoswami.com. And I want to thank you because, as I said when I talked to you earlier privately, that this has been a very, very different experience than the horrendous experience I had speaking to a somewhat bestial atheist. But so I'm really glad that we got to talk, and I appreciate your openness and your reasonableness. And, you obviously stick to your points, but we had a good conversation. I think this kind of conversation is really something I think very positive for the world. So thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. Thanks again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. All the best.